Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gilchrist Sunday 2021. My name is Steve Lindsley. I'm the senior pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm excited today to introduce a couple of guests. But before I do that, I want to briefly tell you a little bit about what Gilchrist Sunday is and why it is an important ministry here at Trinity. Gilchrist Sunday is an annual speaker series, usually takes place during the season of Lent, that connects Trinity and the wider community with leading theologians and ministers, scholars, preachers, for the purpose of digging deeper into what it means to be a faithful witness in today's world. Founded in 1982 and named for charter members Pat and Katie Gilchrist, this ministry is endowed by funds given in their honor by Press and Nancy Millen and the Gilchrist family. Normally, Gilchrist Sunday looks kind of like this. We have a speaker with us on Sunday morning. They teach a combined Sunday school class. They preach in worship. And then sometimes we have a lunch afterwards in our fellowship hall and a Q&A session. Obviously, we are not doing that this year. We also missed out on last year's Gilchrist Sunday. It was scheduled for about 2 weeks after the pandemic hit. We had both speakers lined up. We had a speaker lined up for last year and for this year, and they have graciously agreed to reschedule, one for 2022 and one for 2023. And what I'm excited about is that both of those speakers have agreed to be part of this video today as a way of kind of introducing themselves to us and also to have a conversation together in this moment here. And so I'm grateful to get to introduce these folks to you now. We're pleased, first of all, to have our 2022 Gilchrist Sunday speaker with us, Reverend Dr. Baron Mullis. Hello, Baron.
Hi, Steve.
And we are also grateful for the presence of our 2023 Gilchrist Sunday speaker, Reverend Aisha Brooks-Lytle. Hi, Aisha.
Hi, friends.
So Aisha and Baron, I would love for you to take a moment, if you would, to kind of introduce yourselves to us, say a little bit about your context, what it is that you do, share anything else about your life outside of your work in the church that you would care to. And then just to kind of keep us in the moment and maybe to have a little fun, if you will, I'd love for you to share one thing with us that you miss the most because the pandemic is not letting you do it. And it cannot be work because that's too easy, all right? One thing that you miss the most that you've not been able to do because of the pandemic. Aisha, how about you start us off?
Okay, great. My name is Aisha Brooks-Lytle. I serve as the executive presbyter for the Presbytery of Greater Atlanta. Yesterday was my 3-year installation anniversary in that role. I am here with my mother and my son, Ellington. I'm originally from Philadelphia, so there's some connections there with Baron and I. But I was a jazz major in undergrad and have been doing church for quite some time. So it's just really great to be in this role. I am also engaged to the Reverend Dr. Alonzo Johnson, who serves in the National Church with the Self-Development of People. The one thing I truly, truly miss is live music. And that's either being on the bandstand myself or sitting in the crowd and making a lot of noise. I just miss it.
Thanks, Aisha. Appreciate that. We're so glad that you're here today. Baron, how about you?
Sure. I'm Baron Mullis, and I serve as the senior pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. My local flavor for those who have joined the church in the 10 years since I've been gone from Trinity is I served for 8.5 years as an associate pastor at Trinity, during which I was one of the schedulers for the Gilchrist lecture. So it's a great privilege to me to get to come back. And it was one of my favorite things from my time at Trinity was the abundance of good scholarship that we got to encounter together. And I really, really deeply loved it. I'm also a native of Charlotte, so there's all sorts of common threads there that we share. But I live in Philadelphia with my spouse, Lester, and my thing that I miss the most, that's not work, is that Chestnut Hill, the neighborhood where we live, is a fabulous walking community. And we used to be able to walk over anytime we wanted to a little bistro called Cake, which ironically would very rarely eat cake when we went there, but we would go over to this fabulous little bistro in a greenhouse and have lunch most Fridays. And it was just magnificent. I miss indoor dining, and I look forward to the day that we can do that again.
I think the one thing that I miss most is being able to have it, wear glasses and not and them fogging up. Like I'm gonna be so excited, just that little bit. So I'm looking forward to like not having to constantly take them on and off when I'm needing to keep a mask on. So what I had asked Aisha and Barron to come and be part of this today is just to sort of have a dialogue, since we're not having a quote unquote Gilchrist Sunday. We'll sort of make this our Gilchrist Sunday for this year. And just for the three of us to have a conversation about the moment that we are in. There's a lot that's been happening in our world and in the church and the church in the world. I'll launch it off with this, Barron and Aisha. As the two of you see events happening around us and name them, right? A global pandemic, a vaccine rollout, systemic racism, divisions in our government, and the denigration of public discourse. As you're sort of taking stock of all of that, what biblical or theological, historical anchors kind of ground you in this and inform you as you're sort of discerning what the role of the church and what your particular role in the church, I mean, how we lead forward in that? I just would be really curious about what are those biblical stories, motifs? What's your North Star that sort of meets that moment?
When we were having this conversation earlier, anchors are big in my family. I've got anchor tattoos and all kinds of anchor images. So just the biblical imagery of being anchored in God, being the hope that we have. I will say since the pandemic, the couple things that images that anchor me, and theologians as well. This image of, I've said to people, I've not felt God as more feminine than in this season. For me, it feels sort of like we are in this timeout in a sense. And I just continue to have this vision of Mother God kind of on the back porch saying, you know what, we're just going to sit on the back porch. We're going to sip on some sweet tea and we're going to be here for a while. So you can kind of connect with me and bask in my presence. You're going to see a lot of chaos around you, but you sit still here on this porch with me and we're going to be okay. And so that has been really grounding for me. I would say the being present and sort of the more mystics in our faith, and modern mystics. There's a book that came out curated by Greg Ellison called Anchored in the Current. And it's a bunch of great contributors who look at the work of Howard Thurman and how can we be rooted and grounded. And I love Howard Thurman, but I'm also like, ooh, who wants to be mystical all the time, right? Because there's sort of this kind of ambivalence where you're just like kind of in it with God and not really sure where everything's going to land, except that's the assurance that you don't have to know where everything is going to land or how everything is going to work out, but being in God's presence and being still. So I've been really anchored with not knowing exactly what's happening next, but knowing who is with me in the not knowing. And so I've really tried to I even have a mindfulness coach, right? So how can I really be in the present moment, present with God, sitting on that back porch and just dealing with each step as it comes.
I really love the timeout back porch image, and sweet tea certainly makes that a great image. But I guess really being cognizant of the fact that that is so out of our comfort zone as Americans, as Presbyterians, where we do and production, and that defines so much of our identity and our sense of self-worth. And just for this timeout image, and you mentioned tapping into mystical stuff, that's so just out of our realm. And I think that's part of why we struggle with that. It's really helpful to hear you contextualize it that way.
And this is not something I'm saying to people, I'm saying it with people.
Right.
Like in the morning, it is a struggle to be like, another day of not knowing how it's all going to work out. Okay.
Yep.
And dealing with the anxiety and the anger. And then you can say, all right, Lord, but you're here with me. And you promised never to leave or forsake. And
Right.
you told me that there's always hope. So, yes, Romans 5, 1-5, right? That the endurance and character and stuff, like all these things that lead us to hope. So that is another scriptural image for me as well.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. Baron, what about you? What are kind of your anchors, what are your North Stars in this season?
Well, I'd pick up what Aisha just said about Romans 5 and add Romans 8 to at the end of that magnificent list of things that can't separate us from the love of God. If ever there's a time to be reminded that how profoundly God loves us and how much like flypaper God is going to stick to us, now is it. I do find myself, and this won't surprise people who know me, a little bit taking comfort from being anchored in the history of the church and the knowledge that this is not the first time the church and its people have gone through bad times. I mean, the average life expectancy in Calvin's Geneva was what, 44, 45? I'm 45, so I'd be on my way. I'd have one foot in the grave and another on a banana peel if I were in Calvin's Geneva right now. And that's something that is worth keeping in mind, is that this isn't the first time the church has been through calamitous times. And so for me, as I think about that, it's not that I go back and want to read around in Calvin, dig around in Calvin and find some inspiration there, although I'm sure there's some to be had. It is the music of the church from every era that is the profound anchor for me, because if we want to see how our forebears in faith struggled with these calamities, look at the things they sang. Look at the things we sing in difficult times, and it's just, I mean, our God, our help in ages past. Our hymnal has not enough, but a wonderful selection of the spirituals of enslaved people. This is not the first time the church has been through something calamitous, and the language of our past gives us the language to look to our future in that regard. So to me, the music of the church is so very grounding. And really, if I get down to it, I guess I'm saying also the poetry of the church is grounding, because what is our church music but our poetry set to music? So those are grounding things for me.
Well, I love the way that you talk about the music and the hymns. I mean, I've had people who, we sing a hymn on Sunday, and they'll connect with me afterwards in some form or fashion and say, "Boy, that hymn really felt differently this time around." I wonder if the people in the church are making those connections, maybe indirectly, of, yeah, this is not the first time that the church has been through struggles, and so we can learn by looking back and seeing what the faithful did and how they dealt with those things, I guess.
I think it was the Birmingham Journal did a recap of what pastors were thinking and feeling during the pandemic of 1918. And there were some amazing quotes telling people, like, don't forsake the sweet sacredness of home and be with your families and stay at home. They were sort of like, Christ is with you at home. So just the idea that our spiritual ancestors went through this in the church and survived, right? So yeah, I love that, Baron, our history and the creative arts that gives us hope. I love that.
Yeah. It's sort of a related question, but sort of different. The church in this moment is having to rethink a lot of things. What would you say, and Baron, I'll let you jump on this first. What would you say is a church's calling in this moment? And there's probably a few things, but one or two things that you feel the church really needs to or ought to seize a moment, and as they are seeking to be a witness to Jesus Christ in the world.
I'm fond of telling my own congregation that the word church is a completely articulated mission statement. The minute we say we are a church, we have laid out basically an agenda of things that we are expected to be working toward and that we are hoping to accomplish for the good of humankind and for the advancement of God's reign in the world. I mean, that is what churches do. And so the things that we would set about doing in any other time should be this very same things that we would set about doing now, but with an element of urgency injected by the moment. If we believe that the providing of comfort to God's people is important before the pandemic, it certainly remains important after the pandemic. If we believe that addressing food insecurity was important before the pandemic, it's certainly important when, what's the current jobless rate in Philadelphia? I think it's I don't remember it exactly, but if you look at our unemployment rates as a nation, it's certainly important for the church to be addressing food insecurity and hunger. And you can kind of tick down all of those things that make us church, that are the calls to which Jesus calls us. I mean, I know a lot of churches talk about Matthew 25 as a way of framing that conversation, but if it was a good idea before the pandemic, it's still a good idea. What the pandemic requires of us, though, is a degree of adaptability in how we approach those things. I was a historian by training before I ever became a pastor, and I'm probably serving exactly the right church for me because it's one of the oldest churches in our denomination. In fact, it's actually the church from which American Presbyterianism was born, because the First Presbytery was organized out of the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia in 1706. Of course, we predate it by a good decade there. But this 322-year-old congregation has found ways to adapt our ministry to the current circumstances. And Aisha, you mentioned the 1918 flu pandemic, and I had totally forgotten about this. In 1918, when First Church was located on Washington Square in Philadelphia, they ripped out all the pews and turned the sanctuary into a hospital for the dying. And so that's the level of adaptability in every age the church has to look into. Now, in our case, it's involved us finding ways to do virtually everything online. So I would say everything the church thought was a good idea in February of last year is still a good idea, with an element of urgency injected and the requirement for adaptability to accomplish it.
Yeah, I think churches to that degree are really having to sort of seize a moment and going back to kind of what Aisha was talking about being in timeout. When you're taken out of the grind of the routine, that's where, in some ways, creativity and getting in touch with the Spirit can really happen, so that you are more open to doing that. We're in the midst at Trinity right now of doing some pretty significant upgrades to our AV system, not only to broadcast worship, which is meeting an immediate need, and we're going to continue to do when we're out of the pandemic, but also doing some work that's going to really increase the experience in person. I don't know that there would have been as much of an interest and a stomach for that, quite honestly, just in the normal course of things. But when you interrupt, it gives you an opportunity to seize moments that maybe would not have been as clear to you. Aisha, what about you? What do you feel is the purpose and calling of the church in this season that we're in?
I was probably piggybacking off of Barron's adaptability, and I love the sense of urgency. I always feel like the church is, not responding quick enough. I always want to see people put a little hop in that step in the things of the Lord. One of our pastors, they have a podcast, and we were having this conversation, as well as I just had a chance to preach for APSI, and the question was, what's the pivot? And I think the particularity of this adaptability or this pivot is just the church being really on target around their digital presence, as well as their just to speak. The sermon that I gave for APSI was about new languages of love. And the same way couples have to learn love languages to communicate and to grow and love together, that the church has to fine tune its love languages. And I really think the love language around digital speak, as well as love languages of justice and the nuances around that, is that level of adaptability in particular ways. So the fact that your church is doing, this kind of sound system thing, it's a love language. Like, what is it going to look like? And Bruce Ray's Child talks about this and did it APSI. What is a hybrid table? What does hybrid church look like? Like, going forward, this is the new adaptability. Like, forever and a day, what we're doing right now is a digital conversation, knowing that at some point, the people that are watching this are going to be able to see Barron and myself, to actually hug and high five and small talk. Like, how do we keep this up to say that this is what we're going to do? I mean, I think the justice speak is having, I love, the Matthew 25 invitation. And a lot of our churches are getting deeper into it and just asking those questions about structural racism, about systemic poverty, about congregational health. Like, how are we asking aerial view questions, and what are the solutions to those things? And so that's justice speak. That's nuanced justice speak in that way. And we've seen this world completely overturned in this pandemic. Things that we thought were okay are not okay. Things that we thought we have figured out, we have not figured out. And so I'm really thankful for the urgency. And I really think it's the time out that allows a space for the pivot. It's the time out to say, you know what, we have to adapt or die. Like, we have to do something different. So as much as I cannot believe I'm going to say it, there are aspects of the Rona and the pandemic that I am thankful for. And if it means that we are a little more urgent and adaptable, and our justice speak and our digital speak proclaim the love of Jesus Christ even more so, then I'm thankful for that.
Right. Well, the adapt or die calling that people like you, Aisha, in the positions that you're in, in a presbytery executive position, and I know our executive presbyter, Jan Evanston, here in Charlotte, has been saying the same sort of thing for years, and many others. Sometimes you feel like you're the voice crying out in the wilderness, and stuff like that. But now, in that time out, you got a captive. There's a captive audience to hear it, and realizing for the first time, perhaps, that we're being forced to adapt, and we've got to. So, and I love that I love the way you contextualize that as a love language. That's such an appropriate and an empowering way of understanding the gospel lived out in this particular time there. I'd really dig that. Baron, I don't know, you would look like you were getting ready to chime in, or if you were just in deep thought.
Well, maybe a little bit of both. I'm sort of with Aisha. Part of me doesn't, well, I'm definitely with Aisha on this. Part of me doesn't want to acknowledge there could be any blessing coming out of the coronavirus, but God has this business of redeeming bad situations. And if we're looking closely at what God is doing, we're going to see blessings from this time that all of us would love to turn the page on. As I've mentioned, First Church, I would describe it as a thick culture congregation. Change comes slowly. And yet they were forced to adapt very quickly. Now, what's fascinating about this to me is nobody wants to go back. They want to be able to maintain an online digital presence, particularly for a worship that I don't know that they would have been open to before. But what's fascinating about it to me is that I have older adults in the congregation, folks in their 80s, who in a few years will be folks in their 90s. And they love the fact that they can still worship. Now, one person told me she wasn't coming back unless she could come in her pajamas. And I think that's a bit extreme because she's been worshiping in her pajamas for a year now. But the other thing that's sort of fascinating to me about this is taken out of necessarily being the idea that we adapt to offering a virtual reality for worship for folks who are in their 80s. I have members of the congregation now who joined the church in our first virtual new members class last summer, who to date have never stepped foot in the sanctuary because they found us during the pandemic, they became part of our community during the pandemic, and they joined the church during the pandemic. And now, I suspect they will step foot in the sanctuary at some point down the road. But if we're really thinking about how do we take care of the gospel everywhere, it's going to involve recognizing there's a whole virtual reality out there that we, the church, have been very slow to embrace. And now we're there. What are we going to do with it?
If there's ever a pajama Sunday at First Pres in Philly, I am getting on a plane in my PJs and I'm coming to worship. So that vision just really just made my soul bubble up. So I'm thankful for that. I also want to say, I think this is humbling for this branch of the church. Mm-hmm. There are other branches of the church who've been doing this for a very long time. A very long time. And so I think it's humility to say the entire church, universal, has to get on this. And I think we probably shamed some of our siblings in the non-denominational tree and megachurch tree. that had an inkling about where this was going.
I think when it comes to the digital worship experience, I remember one of the first instances where I knew something had pivoted, to use your word, Aisha, which we're using a lot here, was when we scrambled together, throw together Zoom worship like we're doing now on Sunday on the screen and stuff, and just, make it happen. A couple of weeks into that, I started hearing back from people who said, so-and-so really enjoyed the sermon, or so-and-so really loved that music. And these are people who are of an age and a health situation where they've not been able to come to church in a year or two or three, and they are able to worship now. So I was like, wow, that we are reaching some of our own people who we've not been able to reach in worship before. And then I got an email from a couple in Peoria, Illinois. Hey, we really enjoy your YouTube live worship service. So we are already prepping our congregation for having in-person worship at some point and continuing to broadcast worship. But even when we look around and our people are not seeing as many people as they did before the pandemic, that they can remind themselves that there are people worshiping virtually, and that is going to be okay.
We've been talking about worship, but I'm aware of something that I'd not seen before, which is for 3 months in a row, I had perfect attendance at my session meetings because they were held over Zoom. I never get perfect attendance at my session meetings. There are always 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 excused absences, but I pointed it out to the session and they said it's because you've made it possible for us to be here. And so one of the things we're going to be doing at First Church is our largest classroom is currently, it's called the Mccall Room, and it has the rogues gallery of all the former pastors on the wall. It looks really historic, and it probably is, but it's being upfitted to allow for hybrid meetings, and that one the rogues gallery of the pastors is going to have to move because they're putting a 72-inch screen on that wall in order to be able to have hybrid meetings where people can be present and people can also be virtually present, because I don't think we're going back. I think the church has crossed a Rubicon and we're on our way.
That's history making, what you're talking about. To say, here's something that holds history. And now we are making history by making this a hybrid room, because those are the conversations for us that our committee meeting, you know how many committee meetings and how hard it gets to get to the presbytery office from all over in the perimeter and out of the perimeter. But there are people that have said, now I can serve on these committees because this is available. And so going forward, we've said the same things. These meetings have to be hybrid. What does a hybrid presbytery meeting look like? There are people across, serving outside of the country who are able to come in. Attendance has been great with all of our meetings were virtual, except for February in 2020. So it's just really fascinating. What is, again, shout out to Bruce Ray's child. What does this look like for these a hybrid table, hybrid church, hybrid community?
Amazing. Well, this might dovetail into our last question, and I'm sure we'll be bringing back some of the things we've already been discussing, which has been so rich. But I am curious, if you were going to be our Gilchrist Sunday speaker this year, which would be happening kind of right now within a month or so, what would your theme be? What would your topic be? Every speaker brings a topic, and it's usually something they're passionate about and know something about. What would be your theme if you were to be our speaker now? And I'll let you jump into that first, Aisha.
Sure. I'm actually having a great conversation with New Hope Presbytery, and asked me to do a presentation for the smaller churches. And so we said, what would it look like to have a conversation about resilience and improvisation for the small church? And I'll put in parentheses for every church that wants to have that conversation. As many of you know, and some may or may not know on this call, when it comes to grief and resilience, that's something that's close to my heart. I was a younger widow at 43. And if you follow Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, David Kessler wrote with her. He has added a 6th stage to the 5 stages of grief called Finding Meaning. You can check that out. And so I'm just fascinated about when you go through a grief. And in this season, there's some things we have to grieve. There's some things that we have lost. But when you're able to do that at the appropriate time, there's a way to make sense of resilience and to make sense of what it means that you turn my mourning into dancing, or weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. So what does that look like for the church? The other piece is improvisation. As a jazz vocalist, there's so much there. We were joking around about Jesus kind of dropping the mic where he reads from Isaiah, and this is what I've come to do. And it's sort of his improvisation or reimagination of the prophets, saying to bring release to the captives and good news to the poor. And so what does improving, or, on this old story, what does that look like in each context? So I'm really, when I was having this conversation, shout out to Andy James for the invitation, I was like, I could use this somewhere else. So if I were to be with you all, that very well could be our focal point of resilience and improvisation for the church.
I love that, the jazz of Jesus reading Isaiah. That's awesome. That's great. Barron, what about you if you were coming in the next week or so?
Well, as we joked before we got started, mine's already written because it was supposed to be delivered a year ago. And I would actually, the one thing I can tell you for sure is my title would not change. Now, my title that I was going to present last year was Belonging in an Age of Disintegration. Can Spiritual Disciplines Rescue Faith? Now, what I also know is that I will need to rewrite some sections of that lecture because of what we've learned over the last year. But I do think that we've had to really wrestle with the idea of how do we belong in this time period. And I think belonging is a key part of what it is to be church. We belong to God and we belong to one another. And so that was what I would probably talk about right now. What I'm planning to talk about, or what I had planned to talk about had we been here last year, was how we went wrong in some of our understandings of belonging, how we kind of derailed off of a healthy understanding of what it means to belong to a community of faith into one that's been tainted by American consumerism, which I think has also been called into question and really had a light shown on it this year. American consumerism has really latched on to some key aspects of what made us who we are. Really, I mean, American Christianity was formed in the crucible of American evangelical revivalism, and there are gifts to us from that time period of the church's history, but there are also some theological flaws in it that have led us to where we are right now with a very consumerist mindset regarding how we belong to church and what church owes us versus what we owe church. And so the pandemic has certainly shed some light on that. And so what I can tell you for sure is I'd use the same title because I still think it's important for us to talk about how do we belong in an era when institutions are disintegrating, but I would look at it with light of what we've learned over the last year. So that's my plan. I've got a year to get it figured out now.
Well, that sounds like a perfect back porch sweet tea sipping kind of pondering conversation, both of those as well. I'm just so grateful, Aisha, Barron, for y'all not just taking time today, but I'm also grateful as siblings in Christ for the work that you are doing in your context to help God's church figure out what we are doing now and figure out where we go from here. Let me take time to say to Trinity folks and anybody else watching, go ahead and get these dates on your calendar. This is planning ahead, but hey, it's good. March the 20th, 2022. That is Gilchrist Sunday, when Barron will be with us. And then way far out, if your digital calendar takes you that far, it should. February the 26th of 2023 is when Aisha will be here for Gilchrist Sunday that year. Aisha and Barron, thank y'all so much again for tuning in today and being part of this. Blessings to you and your ministry and in your lives. And hopefully be safe, and we'll figure this out together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. We can't wait to be with you.
Absolutely.